Welcome to our time of review as we seek to solidify and understand what have we just read and also to put it back into the meta-narrative or the story arc of the Bible. And so what you see is the very beginning of the storyline of the Bible through the creation event that God's design was to create stability in his universe. Stability so that men would not have to worry, that they could live an anxious-free life of walking with God in the cool of the day. That was God's goal and intent for Israel. So what happened in chapter 3, you have a destabilizer who enters into the garden. His goal is to kill, steal, and destroy, to bring deep instability. So what does he do? He's based on what happens today. He creates doubt that God is not good, that his word is not true. So as a result of that, when they're evicted from the garden, that begins a culture that lives outside of the presence of God, except for those who call upon the name of the Lord. And so there are actually three characteristics of life outside of the garden that impact all of humanity: the area of our sexuality, the area of our social brokenness, and then our spiritual brokenness. And so it shouldn't surprise us that these three are addressed here in Israel. So what you see during Judges period, the Judges era, is they're casting behind their backs God's word. And so everyone is doing what's right in their own eyes. And so this is going to show up sexually, socially, and spiritually. So how does it show up? Well, the sexual brokenness. Nearly half of the book of Judges, or the Judges era, the narrative during this period describes Samson's tenure and his sexual exploits. The last two chapters describe the relationship between a Levite and his concubine, then Gibeon's rape of this woman, and then her dismembering. So you see the sexual brokenness. Also in this, I think it's important to see that as the Levite was traveling home, he came to two towns that were close, the town of Gibeah and then the town of the Jebusites. The town of the Jebusites was the closest, but as they came close to the perimeter of the Jebusite city, he said, we can't stay there because those people are perverted. It would be safer if we go to the town of our home place, to Gibeah. So it was there that, in Gibeah, that the people rose up. The men of the city came and demanded to have sexual relationship with the man's concubine. And he left her out there to her own devices. She was gang raped, and then she was left at his threshold the next morning, and apparently she had perished from all this. So what you see is the deep brokenness of life outside of the garden, and that people who live outside of God's presence, that we have the ability to do the most horrible things. Then you see the social brokenness, because during the Judges era, you have tribe upon tribe conflict. You have the near decimation of the entire tribe of Benjamin as a result of the story about the Levite and the concubine. And so you have the tribal brokenness of interpersonal relationships where God had designed them to live in relationship with one another. Now fear abounds, and there's not a safe place for people to reside. It is an unstable environment. Then you see the spiritual brokenness. And how do you see this? Because the people have intermarried with the peoples around them, and now they're worshiping the gods of the peoples around them. And what you see in idolatry, it always defaces the image of God in a person. And so you see that these three things are descriptive of people who live outside of the presence of God, descriptive of a culture that has chosen the path of disobedience. And what does this look like as a whole? But what you see as a highlight during our week's reading, to me, it's so exciting when I read the book of Ruth, because it says, in the midst of deep darkness, in the midst of sexual and spiritual and social brokenness, God is still at work. And how is he at work? Why? He's fulfilling a promise that he made about the seed who would come in Genesis 3:15. He made a promise about Abraham's descendants would be a blessing to the nation. So now we're introduced to the Moabite woman. Her name is Ruth. And we're also told from the very beginning of the story that God is going to commit the coming of that seed through Judah to Shiloh, to whom the seed must come, to whom it's been foretold. And so what you see is God highlighting for us a little family from Judah who now have lived in Moab. And obviously terrible times have occurred. Naomi's lost her husband. She's lost her two sons. She only has her two daughter-in-laws. But then it says that she hears that God has visited his people. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the words of God. And she determines to go back to Bethlehem, back to the place of her birth, the place of bread. And this is the place where God is going to continue his story by raising up the kinsman redeemer, Boaz, from the tribe of Judah. And he is going to marry her daughter-in-law, replace the missing seed of Elimelech from the tribe of Judah. And he's going to introduce us to that genealogy that concludes at the book of Ruth, that God is still marking time, that God is still accomplishing his purposes. Why? Because we're introduced to the next era, which will be the kingdom era, with the introduction of Obed, who has Jesse, who in turn has David. What exciting days as we continue to plummet the story of God's word, and we'll never get to the bottom how majestic he is, how wondrous he is, how wise he is, and how gracious he is to still work in times of darkness to accomplish his word.